So when I pick up the newspaper, I see a lot of problems and not a lot of solutions. So I began ending every conversation with a new idea on how to solve something. And I stopped reading the news. Few fields suffer from this problem more than the opioid epidemic, and we are lucky to have with us today one of the world's experts on both the problem and the solutions. Keith Humphreys, Stanford's Esther Ting Memorial Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, is not just an extraordinary researcher, but an extraordinarily effective advocate and designer of public policies at the national and international levels. So please welcome to the stage, Keith Humphreys.
Hey, everybody. It's good to be here. So many captains of industry in the audience. I feel like I should say something to establish my cred as an entrepreneur. Wasn't in my bio. I just want to say I did once found a nonprofit. It wasn't supposed to be a nonprofit, but it's a difficult economy out there, people. I mean, give me a break, all right? So this is a talk about policy. Slides are terrific for science, but in policy we tend to believe all power corrupts. PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So I'm just going to talk to you. We've seen a lot of terrific talks the last couple of days, including by my colleagues here, that in some way are focused on the challenge of translation. Like, how do you take an EEG dry brain map and turn that into a diagnostic tool that a clinician can actually use? How do you take findings from lower primates and turn them into better treatments for kids who have autism? How do you take the discovery of hypocretin and turn it into better sleep medicine? Those questions about utility of neuroscience, you have that same question if you're an entrepreneur because you're translating, trying to get a product out there into market. That's another important part of translation. What I'm going to talk about is a third type of translation that doesn't get a lot of attention, which is translating up. How do we get the science we do into the hands of the people who write the rules of the game? Members of Congress, governors, county commissioners, health regulators, and so on. That does not happen very much. I mean, even a sympathetic critic would say that doesn't happen very much. I mean, I could think of applications every talk I just saw to education, child development, health care, but I'm quite sure that people who would write those laws wouldn't even necessarily know about the terrific science that's being done. And it's very true in my area. I work as mentioned, in drug policy. We constantly do things in drug policy that even the most simple science would tell you are counterproductive, and yet it continues to go on. And most professors get mad at this at some point, which is understandable, but it's also true that academics are often part of the problem. I mean, try to think of a company that sells its products using the same tactics that professors use to get policymakers to pay attention to their science. You can't, because it already went out of business while I was asking that question, right? What scientists do is they put their science in obscure outlets for each other, in obscure language, and sort of their own community, and then they're disappointed that it isn't somehow magically translated to Washington or state capitals or county government. But any successful company would tell you, if you want to sell a product, you have to do market research. You have to figure out who are your customers, what do they want, and how do you reach them. So let me tell you, we actually know a fair amount about that, about the policy world. So one of the first things, just very practically, discretionary reading time. This has been studied from many different decision makers. In Congress, it's about 10 minutes a day. You get a little more at the state level. But most people are going to have like 15 minutes, maybe half an hour a day to read something by choice. And when they have that choice, they do not read PNAS. Because they really feel that the editorials in Nature are just so much stronger. And no, they don't read Nature either. What they mainly read are mass media. If you represent Cambridge in their state legislature or in the Congress, and the Boston Globe covers a study saying Cambridge has a high rate of autism, you're going to read that story because you know your constituents will read it, and you know your fellow legislators would read it. And that is to the extent science gets in. Usually it's that way, translated somewhat incorrectly through the media. But very rarely do you actually have a policymaker in touch with the actual article. The second thing is, contrary to what people think, there is no data reception problem. It's not a lack of data any more than it is, if you Google on your phone, how do I lose weight? It's not, wow, nobody has any ideas. That's, geez, I would have thought someone would have asked that question before, right? No, instead you get 2.5 bazillion websites telling you how to lose weight. And the problem is which one of these is true and which one of these is garbage. And this is the policy maker's dilemma. When I worked in the White House, I had access to the Library of Congress. They can find anything. I never asked them for anything because my challenge was people were constantly stuffing things in my hand all day long saying there was this information. I had to figure out which was the gold and which was the garbage. The third thing is the data doesn't matter unless the incentives are there for someone to use it. Okay, it is rare that people are moved just by information. I mean, have you ever walked up to someone who was smoking and said, do you know smoking's bad for you? And go, Jesus Christ, why didn't somebody tell me? That information's out there, okay, and people are still smoking anyway, right? You have to focus on what are the incentives. And I had experienced this while we were doing the big legislative package that came through on opioids. I worked on a lot. And one of the committees where I testified, I said, there's a scientific problem here, which is we do not know at all how many Americans use heroin and how many are addicted to it. We have no idea. I said this was not a subcommittee, it was a full committee, so there's a ton of members in the room. It's broadcast live on C-SPAN, so that's like 3 or 4 more people watching. And nobody said anything. They're just like, huh, and they just went on. 6 months later, when the draft of the bill said that the federal grants would be allocated based on the severity of your heroin problem, my voicemail box virtually exploded from everyone saying, what were you saying about that we didn't actually know how many people use heroin? Because that's how my state's going to get money. And then they wanted to know. My information was useless at the time until that incentive came about, and then all of a sudden it was a great moment, and now they're all thinking about how do we solve this scientific problem. So those are our 3 challenges there. Our own valley of death, if you want to say that, to get things to policy. We have the wrong communication methods and channels. We think it's a volume of information problem. It is not. It's a quality detection problem. And we're trying to make information influential without regard to whatever the current political incentives are. So what do you do about that? Well, the thing that we have concluded, at least at Stanford, is you have to build a disease-specific network that brings together people who are normally not in the same room together. And that means, scary as it may sound, politicians and scientists sitting at the same table. So we have a group, we have a network that focuses on addiction policy, which we call the Stanford Network on Addiction Policy. Thank you, I was up all night thinking of that. Appreciate it, yeah. SNAP, right? Our core group is 15 people. 7 of them are scientists who study addiction at Stanford, mostly neuroscience. We have some people more on the behavioral side. And then we have people who actually have to work on these problems in real life. We have Steve Williams, who's the mayor of Huntington, West Virginia, the town with the highest overdose rate in the country. We have the chair of our House Health Committee in California. We have an advisor to a governor. We have a state Supreme Court justice. And our goal is to share information in both directions. So let the scientists understand why policy is made the way it is, what issues are ripe and where you can make a difference, and then the scientists to tell policymakers things they really often don't know. Why would they know them? About the details of what are different drugs, how do they affect the body, what is addiction, what treatments work, what preventions keep kids safe, what is good harm reduction, all those kinds of things. And like any good network, we take advantage of the weak ties. So you have, your network is strong ties, that's the people you know. Your weak ties are the network of the people in your network. You don't know them, but they can get them to them. And we slavishly and openly ask everyone, open your networks to us and let us go out there and make a difference. We just got back, last month, Tom Coderre, who's the special advisor to the governor of Rhode Island, had us out. We had a joint House and Senate hearing just for our scientists, without any lobbyists there, just us. And I talked about if you legalize cannabis, what are some regulatory strategies that will reduce public health harm? Anna Lemke talked about the opioid epidemic and different ways to keep people safe while also preserving the fact you've got to have opioids. They're very important in medicine. And Bonnie Halpern-Felsher talked about vaping, which is rising really sharply among kids, and different strategies that might be used to disrupt that. And we also had the opportunity to meet with the House and Senate president and all the gubernatorial advisors, the state health secretary, all those kinds of things, and convey a lot of information in a really sort of exciting field trip that we never could have done. It would have taken forever to get that much access that we were able to get through Tom being close with the governor. So how does the network deal with these 3 challenges? So first, it's changing the communication methods and channels, right? Instead of the idea of you publish it in Nature and then you hope someone sees it, you're actually talking to the person, and then you learn how to become better at it. Because one of the most common things that happens is the meetings, the scientist said, you should just do this, that, and this, and the policymaker says, I don't understand what you just said. I need you to say it without all the jargon and that kind of thing. And then and it's not that the policymakers are stupid, they're actually generally educated, smart people, but scientists haven't learned how to talk to them, so they have to learn how to do that. The second thing is you get the quality detection problem solved because you have relationship. And that is the same thing you use, I'm sure, in your daily life. When you hear something about this new startup is hot, this scientific paper is good, well, you hear that way too many times to respond. And so what you value is when it comes from someone you know you trust. this guy, this gal tends to give good advice about what paper to read. This gal, this guy gives good advice about what startup to read. So it's building those relationships between the scientists and the policymakers. So when they hear, oh, wait a minute, you're just not the 10,000th person to tell me something about a new medication that could treat heroin addiction. You're somebody I know I can count on who's not going to be flim-flamming me, but will give me a straight answer. The last thing is it changes the incentives. There are social incentives in a group like that. People like to be smart. They like to be informed. The policymakers now like to tell other policymakers about, hey, I'm going to Stanford. We're working on science. How about you? That kind of thing. And the scientists like to say, I just worked on a bill that passed. It's going to change the way we do mental health insurance. Those kinds of things. But it's also to be effective. People want to succeed in what they're doing. And most policymakers, contrary to stereotypes, actually want to do good things. And they often can't because they don't have the information. And so that's a real satisfaction for them to be able to say, I wrote a regulatory bill. We just did something on cannabidiol, which is a component of the cannabis plant. And I got advice from Stanford. I know exactly what it is. The draft legislation makes perfect sense. This is going to be good. That makes them feel more effective. So our team's focused on addiction, but I think that's just the one of many, many diseases. We need to have these kinds of networks. They're different. The only other example I know is the MacArthur Mental Health Network did this for a while, though it now doesn't exist, and that group had a lot of impact. But if you're in an area where we're focused on an illness and you feel like the science is not getting through, I would really encourage you to found a network like this. Bring together the people who normally don't talk to each other, get them around the same table, and get the learning going. And when I saw that great talk the other day about where do we underinvest, that's what I thought. We need to invest in more of that for Alzheimer's. We need to invest for autism. We need to invest for everything else. People, places, funds. It's those kinds of networks that make science translatable up. Thank you.